Hi everyone, welcome back to our webinar series on ocean-friendly gardens. And today we will be talking about pruning schedules in the ocean-friendly gardens. So we'll touch on pruning basics, pruning shrubs, pruning perennials, pruning grasses and sedges, pruning annuals, and succulent care. And these are all framed in the type of plants that are in the ocean-friendly gardens right now. So pruning in nature happens by fires, storms, animals browsing. So pruning is something that plants are adapted to. It's something that lots of them need at some point in their lifespan. But when we are pruning, which is the removing of parts of plants, we want to make sure we're doing it in a structural manner. We want to make sure we're being intentional because the plants do have to heal from these cuts. And so, we want to do it to the best of our ability, and we want to have plant health in mind, not necessarily we need this bush out the way or it needs to be smaller. We want to focus on plant health first and foremost, and then reach into that. Should this bush be smaller, maybe it needs to be replaced by a smaller bush in the first place, right? So there are several reasons why we would prune. Promote health and vigor, that's a big one. It's linked to plant hormones. They are stimulated by pruning. Keeping up appearances, of course, I mentioned this last time in our webinar. These are ornamental gardens, so having them aesthetically pleasing is a big part of it. We want to enhance natural form of the plants. That is a big one. These are native plants and we want to take care of their natural forms. Increasing flowering or fruiting, specifically flowering, since these are ornamental plants and we don't necessarily use them for their fruit. Well, there's some like toyon and coffee berry, but for the most part, flowering. Controlling the size, that's a part of it. Some plants, we do want to control the size, but we do control the size in a structural manner where we're not, taking over the integrity of the shape, and we're doing it to help the plant. You want to guide the growth. That's a big one, especially since last time we talked about replacement schedules and when to bring in new plants. If you are bringing in a new plant, you do kind of want to make sure that you're there from the start, guiding the growth in the direction that you want it to grow in. If there's a view you want to manage, so specifically lots of these gardens are, there may be a window nearby, or you want to make sure you're not blocking the street, all kind of things like that. Mending damage, that's a big one. If there's wind damage or frost damage or pest damage, you want to make sure that you attend to that as soon as possible. And eliminating a hazard. Safety is a huge part of these gardens. They are in public spaces. So if there's a hazard, there's a branch, it looks a little precarious. If there's plants in the walkway, like on this picture here, obviously that's something that is a hazard. So those are things that we want to talk about as well for reasons why we prune. Enhancing natural form is a big topic that I want to touch on just a bit, because for these particular plants, natural form is important. These ocean-friendly garden plants, most of them being native Californian plants, they do not withstand a lot of heavy pruning. So when we chose them in the first place, of course, we should have considered its natural form, but even if you didn't, whatever space is in, you want to look up whatever the natural form of this plant is supposed to be and kind of keep the integrity of that, because you cannot force a plant to be an oval all the time. That's not going to be helpful to a plant or a box. So we want to make sure that we're enhancing the natural form of the plants. And that brings me to hedges versus shrubs. This is a big conversation. This is a conversation that probably every maintenance supervisor has to have with some landscaper at some point, because it's very common that hedges are something that people make when they're supposed to be shrubs. So hedges are structural, neatly trimmed. They're used in gardens for a screen or just adding structure. While shrubs are a little bit more free-flowing. You're letting the natural shape shine. And there are certain plants that are very, very good at being hedges, junipers, cypress, boxwood, euonymus. And those plants are that for a reason. They make that soft herbaceous growth. They're used to being trimmed. You know, they have basically been bred to be hedges in that way. While many of the plants in the ocean-friendly gardens, they cannot withstand that kind of pruning. They cannot withstand being made into a box or a circle. So that's something that you really have to resist. And making hedges, it is easier than structurally pruning a shrub to have a natural form, because you can just go in there with your power trimmer. You can just go one side, top, side, and it's done. But that's not going to be the best method for many of the plants in the garden. So that's something you want to be mindful of. So where to start with pruning? You know, first and foremost, even before you're thinking about the size or all that kind of stuff, you want to look at the plant, assess the plant, and you want to start with the 4 Ds, which are wood that is dead, pieces of the plant that are dead, disease. So if there is a pest infestation, you definitely want to get rid of that for several reasons. You know, the pest could spread. You want to just get rid of it. Damage, wind damage, someone trampled through the garden, all kind of things could have happened. You want to get rid of that. And then deranged branches. And so here's a good example of deranged branches. And this is a very precarious situation. It's not currently happening in any other gardens now, but you know, if you see 2 branches rubbing together, getting close together, in the future, this could be a very, very big hazard. So that's something you want to, you know, get in there and do right away. You also want to follow the 1/3 rule. Never remove more than 1/3 of a plant. There's an asterisk there because there is a special method of pruning that I'll talk about a little bit later called cutting back hard or coppice, where you would remove more than 1/3. But for a general rule, you don't want to remove more than 1/3 because many plants cannot withstand being cut back hard. And so the 1/3 rule, you know, stands pretty strong. And you also want to avoid pruning in the wrong season because it could open the plant up to frost damage or sun damage, heat damage, or a pest infestation. Because the pest is super active at the time you prune, and this plant is susceptible. So you don't want to end up in that situation. So you want to make sure you do it in the season that is best for the particular plant. And you also want to try to avoid pruning when the soil is wet. Even though we have a really thick mulch layer at the gardens, pruning while the soil is wet, you can compact the soil even more. So that's not something you want to do. And you know, landscaping in the rain is difficult anyway. So don't do it then. So here are some tools that can be used for the ocean-friendly gardens. So bypass pruners, those are, you know, the #1 tool that every landscaper uses. I'm sure everyone has a pair of these. These are good for branches that are less than 2/3, 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Loppers, which are similar to bypass pruners, you can use those for branches that are 2 inches and up. A power trimmer. So power trimmers are good for soft herbaceous growth, maybe semi-hardwood. You never want to use these on super woody shrubs or branches because the cut is just going to be so ragged and it's not going to look good no matter how sharp you get the trimmer. It's not going to look good, so it's not something you want to do, even though it is the quickest and the fastest way to do things. Shears, those are for soft herbaceous growth. Hand saw for branches that are bigger than 2 inches in diameter. A pole saw for branches that are high up and bigger in diameter. So that's something you would use in trees. And then a string trimmer. So string trimmers are not used for eradication of weeds in ocean-friendly gardens, but you can use a string trimmer to cut back ornamental grasses. Of course, you probably would have to replace the string that you currently have for a much thicker one for it to work really well, but that is what a string trimmer can be used for. Once again, not eradication of weeds. That's not a method that is a part of the criteria for ocean-friendly gardens. So, you know, use the right tools. The right tools are determined by the plant material that you're working on and whatever the situation is. You know, where is it at in the bush? Is it on the ground? All kind of stuff like that. And of course, goes without mentioning, Wear your PPE, protect your eyes, hands, ears, because safety is very, very important when you're using tools, branches falling, all that kind of stuff. So make sure you protect yourself properly. So one rule that I always want to remind people of when we're talking about ocean friendly gardens, the reason that they're so great for the environment and all that stuff is because we're doing less. We're letting these plants have a more natural looking, free form kind of look to them. They're not going to be perfect hedges and circles and squares. That's not what we're looking for with these gardens. And so we're using less supplemental water. And so, in turn, we'll probably end up doing less pruning. Think about a turf grass where you're mowing or pruning once a week. In turn, you're using a lot of supplemental water. So you have to use that irrigation or the grass is going to suffer. And so this is the opposite end of that spectrum, right? So monthly maintenance events are what we're looking for too. So these prunings are not happening on a weekly basis. They're happening, once or twice a season. We're doing less and we're letting the gardens be more natural and open, how California native plants will be growing in their native habitats, right? So here are some types of pruning. I'm going to be using several terms when we get into the nitty gritty on specific types of pruning. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So deadheading is the practice of removing splint blooms. So once the flowers are done being beautiful and they're turning all brown, deadheading is a practice that some people do to get rid of those dead flowers. Tranning is a type of pruning that should be done on young plants, specifically trees and woody shrubs, especially ones that are going to live for a really long time. So I'm talking about like Coffin Berry, which lives for 100 to 150 years. You definitely want to, if you have a young one, you want to train it. And that's basically removing weak shoots, branches that are heading in the wrong directions. You want to remove crossing branches and stuff like that. Just so going into the future, it can have a nice shape. Dividing is a type of pruning that is done to ornamental grasses. It is also a method of propagation for ornamental grasses where you dig up the grass, including the root ball, and then you divide it into two, and then you can plant one back. And so this is good for rejuvenation of grasses when they're starting to look a little weak. Pinching is the process of removing small herbaceous stems, and when you remove one of the stems, it's going to basically stimulate the buds, the lateral buds that are down the branch. And in doing this, you're removing one, but then you end up getting two, so you end up with a plant that is bushier and fuller. Heading back is reducing the size of the branch. This is important because you have to do this correctly. You can't just head back the plant anywhere. You have to head it back to the nearest node. You have to make those nice slanted cross cuts, which are pruners, which I'm sure everyone knows about. And then thinning, which is removing smaller branches to a larger branch or cutting branches all the way to the ground. And what this does is it doesn't change the natural form of the plant, but it does open up the canopy so more air can blow through it. And this, having a plant that is nice and open is good because it will reduce the chances of, disease outbreaks, or the plant could be rotting if there's too much water or moisture. And then coppice, or you might see it as cutting back hard, which is the practice of taking a plant, you can cut it, about inches from the ground basically, and then it'll eventually grow back into a brand new plant. So that is a good tool to have, especially for ornamental grasses, and certain shrubs you can do that too as well, and I'll point those out when we get there. Also, consider pruning seasons. Like I said, plants have to heal from these cuts, and you want to make sure that the plant is pruned in the right season so it has the chance to heal. So we'll talk about late winter pruning, spring pruning, early summer pruning, late summer pruning, fall pruning. And so obviously there's different ranging temperatures at this time. If the plant is deciduous, it's going to be looking different at this time. So that's always something to consider. If it's a flowering plant, you don't want to necessarily go in there and do hard pruning before the flowers develop, because then, you know, they're not going to have many flowers when springtime comes. So all kind of things to consider when you are going in there to prune. Okay, so let's get right into it. We're going to talk about the plants that are specifically in the gardens and pruning methods that and pruning events that should happen on these plants. So ceanothus, you know, it's huge in these gardens. It's one of the favorite California natives amongst many people. It requires very, very gentle pruning to keep in good condition. I'm talking, you should look at it and admire it for its beauty and not really prune it a lot at all, because you can easily get in a really bad situation with this plant, which I pointed out last time as well. So in the summer, you want to prune after the flowers are spent. So once the flowers are dead, you can go in there and prune it, but you want to make sure that you're only pruning the soft herbaceous stems. A hard and fast rule: if the diameter of the stem is larger than a pencil, do not prune it, because it is not going to recover from that. It's likely not going to grow back. And what you're doing is effectively shortening the life of this plant. So this is the image that I showed last time too. Once you start trimming the older, thicker branches beyond the green area, you will end up with ugly dead stumps. And this is something that you definitely have to make sure that people are paying attention to when you tell them, and you know, you show them exactly what you're talking about, because obviously if you have a really big bush like this, you know, they can get this big, right? And then you go in there with a power trimmer and you're just like, well, I'm just gonna trim it up on the sides and, you know, trying to make a shape out of it. You're going to end up with this, and it's not going to come back from that. So that's not a situation you want to be in. And I've seen it happen many, many times over and over, where it's pruned too hard and see, no, this doesn't come back in the same way, and it eventually has to be replaced. Then we have buckwheat. There are multiple types of buckwheat plants that are in the ocean-friendly gardens. St. Catherine's lace, San Miguel, island buckwheat, and California buckwheat, of course. So to control the size, you want to cut back as much of the newest growth as desired while not in flowering. So it'll flower in the spring. So after that, that's when you want to consider, you know, is the size getting too big, because you do want to have those flowers. Obviously, this goes without saying, if it's in a walkway or if it's preventing, you know, causing a hazard, you do want to go in there and control that size, even if it's in flowering, because first and foremost, these gardens are in public spaces, and that's something we have to consider. Also, if they're entrenching some of the features of an ocean-friendly garden, like the catch basins, or you know, some other feature that's used, or I mean, they could grow a little bit into the permeable paver area and it won't be the end of the world, but you know, you obviously don't want it to completely cover that area, so you do want to consider those features. No deadheading necessary. And that's kind of with most of these plants. You can deadhead if you want, but since a lot of them are California native plants, those seeds that the plants will make, they'll likely be food for birds or whatever animals, and so you don't want to deadhead them. And for buckwheat in particular, one of the characteristics and one of the reasons people like this plant is because after the flowers are spent, they kind of have like these brown flowers, and it still looks kind of nice and cool, so people typically don't deadhead them, and it would be putting a lot more labor into this plant than you should be anyway. In the fall, older plants that look like they need refreshing, so if it looks a little rangy and you have like a lot of brown stems, you can cut this plant back pretty hard. So you can cut it back to, you know, 6 inches from the ground, and then it'll come back in the spring, and you'll have like a new plant that refreshed. So that's something to keep in mind as your buckwheats are getting older. The next shrub we'll talk about are sages. There's many sages. I didn't even list all of them. There's so many that can be in the gardens. You want to prune as a new growth begins, because they can get a little unruly, I have to admit. So what you want to do is you want to go in there and pinch And so pinching is removing that herbaceous growth, and the term pinching came from people were initially pinching it with their fingers, and they would go in there and pinch them. Obviously, you're not going to do that because this is a very, large plant, or it can get very large. And so what you can do is use head shears, like the big scissors, and just go in there and like clip it up, make sure you're keeping that natural integrity of the shape, but you go in there and you're doing all that soft growth, and that will help the plant get fuller and denser. In the late fall, you can cut back 1/3 to half of this plant, and remember that asterisk. Usually you want to never cut more than 1/3, but in this case, this plant is receptive to that. But you want to make sure that when you're doing this, you're not cutting into the hardwood once again. You're using that soft leafy area to work with, and that will help the plant become more compact if it's getting a little bit too sprawling and spreading. And once again, doesn't hurt mentioning again, avoid pruning old woody growth on these stages because they will not have the chance to recover. They're not going to push out new leaves, new branches, and they're going to end up looking a mess. So that's something to consider as well. Coffee berry, which is another lovely California native. This particular cultivar at the gardens is Eve's Case. So you want to head back new growth in the spring to promote form. And so this is something you want to actively make sure you go out and do every spring because these plants are so long-lived. You want to make sure that you're constantly trying to help the form. And they do have a natural form that is kind of irregularly shaped. So, but you still want to go out there and make sure that it's not getting too, you might have one branch that grows really tall and weep away from the plant. You want to make sure that's something that you are considering and going out there to take care of. In the fall, you can lightly head back if needed. So if you didn't go super heavy in the spring because you didn't want to mess up the farm too much, you can go back in the fall and lightly head it back, and it'll be just fine. But one of the cool features about this plant, which I think is cool because it's not something that can happen in every plant, you can coppice this plant in the early of spring. So you can cut this plant all the way down to the ground and it will still come back. And so maybe you have a coffin berry in the garden and it is beyond the size that should be in that space. The form is all messed up. That is a possibility that you can do that if needed. But once again, this is something that, you assess the plant, heading back will not work necessarily. That's when you take, I'm going to coppice this plant and cut it all the way to the ground. Then we'll talk about currants. So there's also a whole bunch of species of currant plants that are in the gardens. So young plants, you definitely want to be in there pinching these plants back because they can get a little sprawling looking if you don't, particularly make them dense. But that's if you desire it, if you think it'll look best in that space. Because there are so many plants in the gardens, and the gardens are fairly small, that you do have to consider that you may need to pinch it back to get that dense shape instead of having it spreading super far and wide. They do typically have sprawling branches, especially the evergreen currant. So what you want to do is pin down those branches. What I do is I take the pins from drip lines, and I just take one of those and I pin down the branch until it can tack down and root, and then I'll take it out. And that's basically so it's not like growing upwards, but it has like a smooth, dense mat to it. In the fall, of course, you can thin it out and remove dead branches. But if it doesn't need it, once again, it's up to your discretion. Look at the plant, assess it, and decide what would be the right route to take for the plant. In the spring, you can lightly head it back to keep the plant in its bounds. Remember, once again, some of these do have sprawling branches, and so you want to keep it in its bounds. You don't want it encroaching into the other plants too much or growing into any of the features that make it an ocean-friendly garden. Then we have Manzanita, which is also a very popular plant in the garden. There's also 2 different species that we have, or 2 different cultivars. So they do not require much pruning at all. I would, mainly leave them alone. In the fall, you can thin them out. People like to thin them out so they can see more of the stems, because the stems are a feature that people like about this plant, as well as the foliage. So that's something to consider. Thin it out if you need to. These plants are super susceptible to a leaf gall aphid. So you'll notice bubbling on the leaves and little galls on the leaves. And so if you see that, you want to remove the damage after the winter spring flowering, because it's a insect, so it will spread to other plants, other parts of the plants, and then maybe even other plants if they're susceptible to the leaf gall aphid. And then, of course, I didn't mention it yet, but if you are pruning with your tools, you want to make sure that you're cleaning them, from plant to plant, in order to not spread diseases, especially from garden to garden, right? So if you're doing multiple gardens in one day, you want to make sure you're going in there and you're cleaning your pruners with some, some kind of bleach or alcohol to sanitize them. Of course, not, straight bleach or alcohol. You want to dilute it, but sanitizing is important, especially for native plants. Before I go on, I'll entertain any questions that may have came up.
Hi, Jennifer here. No questions so far, so you're good to proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about pruning perennials. So one of the most popular perennials, also one of my favorite perennials that the gardens have, yarrow. Yarrow are prolific bloomers, those beautiful flowers. It's kind of a showstopper when you pass by. So they'll flower in mid-spring into summer. You could deadhead them to extend the bloom cycle. I say you could because look at all these blooms, and consider cutting off each dead one and going in there. That would be a huge amount of work. If you're up for it, if you have a smaller amount of yarrow, that's something you can consider. Once the flowers turn brown and they're spent, you can go in there and deadhead them, and then that'll extend the blooming cycle if desired. What you should be doing, because yarrow have a short life, every spring divide the plants. And so, you dig them up, you can divide them, chop it in half, and you want to replant only the vigorous portions. So the parts that have, nice green stems and healthy looking leaves, you can replant those. And then the rest of it, you can compost or, green recycle or whatever the case. After the flowers are spent, though, you can also coppice this plant. So you can cut this plant all the way to the ground. And you could do that. This is where you can use your string trimmer once again. You can string trim this plant to the ground, or you can use a power trimmer and you can cut the plant to the ground and then it'll come back. It's a good method for these plants because they can get a little woody looking sometimes and large. So you want to make sure you're keeping them in their bounds and keeping them fresh and vigorous. Beach evening primrose. This is a perennial that is specifically at the Manhattan Beach Ocean Friendly Garden. It is a California native. It grows a dense mat forming on the ground. It has like a creeping like feature to it. It is not long lived. It's not going to live for a really long time, but it does reseed, so you'll probably always have it as long as the conditions are right. So, once it ends up drying up and dying, and the middle of the plant will get super woody and the leaves won't look as vigorous, you can pretty much just rest assured that the life of the plant is over, but it'll come back even if you don't plant another one. In the fall, if you need to, you can cut it back to 4 inches. So you can make small little mounds out of it if it's getting like super large and spreading rapidly, or getting too bushy, too full, there's too many weeds in it. These are reasons that you can cut it back. Then we have Douglas iris, which is also a great plant, but it is one that there's a small caveat. You definitely, like I said, plant identification is so important. Oftentimes, these plants are looked at as grasses. And so some of the practices that we do with ornamental grasses are done to these plants, and well, you know, it's not going to work out. The plant's going to die. So you want to be mindful of that. They do grow in these small clumps, and they spread via rhizomes. And so rhizomes are horizontal underground stems, and the plants will spread by that. And so if you have one clump, you may end up with many more down the line, which is a good thing because they do make beautiful flowers. If desired, you can deadhead 1 month after flowering. We say 1 month because this gives the flowers to drop seeds, the birds can eat the seeds, all that kind of good stuff. And then you can just remove the dead flowers. So let's definitely practice that. Because it is a smaller plant, you can do that. And every few years you want to divide the plant. So dig it up, you know, break it in half and divide it and plant new pieces, and this to reinvigorate the plant. But what I was saying is about practices for ornamental plants. You cannot cut this plant to the ground and expect it to come back because it simply will not. So when this plant is not in bloom, it typically kind of looks like a grass. And so people will confuse it and cut it to the ground and it will not come back. So something to keep in mind. And then we have Coyote Bush, which is also a big one at the Manhattan Beach Ocean Friendly Garden. In spring, you pretty much have to head back to new growth. This plant is such a vigorous grower. It's very shrubby, it's very bushy. So you have to head it back so it's not encroaching or growing over the walls. It can be sheared like a hedge. This is one plant in this whole group of California native plants that actually can withstand heavy shearing like a hedge. Should you cut it into a ball? No, it's gonna look out of place. But you can go in there with some hedging shears and shear it up real nice, making sure you're keeping that natural form, of course, to keep it in bounds and small. Every 3 to 4 years, you can coppice this plant in the winter. And so this is something I would definitely suggest for this plant because it can get so large and it can take over a whole area and grow into other plants. You want to coppice it and keep it small. And also keeping it small, it makes you appreciate it more. It doesn't just look like some big shrub. You can kind of see the personality of it. Okay, going into grasses and sedges. So cutting back grasses is a conversation that is, you know, taught everywhere when we're talking about ornamental grasses. And so basically what you do is you gather up the grass and then you cut it back. Simply that, you cut it back to the ground basically. There are some tool options, like I said. A power trimmer can be used. This is my least favorite tool for this particular job because even when the blades are super sharp, I'm talking you just came from the lawnmower shop and they sharpen them, it's still gonna be pretty hard to do. So it probably deserves to be at the bottom of the list. You can use a sod cutter. So that's assuming that, you know, you're going in there, you're gathering it up with one hand and you're cutting it with the sod cutter with other. You can use a string trimmer, which is probably the quickest and the easiest way to do it when you get a thicker string for sure. You could use a machete, same kind of situation with a sod cutter. And then in this picture, you can see they use head shears. Head shears, it's gonna take a little bit more time because you probably have to do it like piece by piece by piece, but you know, it's a good option. So obviously we have our Dune Sedge and our Field Sedge, which are huge parts of the gardens. They're, you know, great sedges. They grow pretty rambunctiously green. They have that nice form, and you know, they blow in the wind and all that good stuff. In the fall, you want to cut them back to the ground because they are kind of, you know, wild growing. Cut them back, you know, if you can, if you have the time. It's definitely something I would suggest. If you don't do it every year, you definitely want to look into doing it every other year. Also, you want to make sure you're like actively raking out these grasses because there are, like, you know, leaves that will come up brown and die, and you want to rake them out so they look fresh and not like they're dying. If you need to, you can tighten them up with a mid-season cut. So cutting back, you know, 1.5 to 3 inches, and in the late summer, in the late spring or early summer, to cut it down to the ground if you need to, if they're getting too large and hard to control again. So corralling is necessary for these grasses, and so lots of these grasses are near you know, the watershed features or the edges maybe, so, or permeable pavers. So you definitely want to corral these grasses to get them out of the cracks in the pavers. Make sure they're not covering up the watershed features. So that's something you have to do. You can simply just go in there and dig the plant out. That's the best option. Once again, if you think you could just cut it back to the ground, that is not a method of corralling, because if anything, you just ensure that it's going to come back in that spot. So something to be mindful of. Then we have moody grasses, which have, you know, the beautiful flowers, especially the pink moody grass. So in the late winter or early spring, you want to cut it back to a 6-inch mound. You want to use a power trimmer or a weeder, which is a string trimmer. I would suggest a string trimmer. You know, it might take some practice if you've never done it before, but definitely a quick and easy way to cut grasses to the ground. And then deer grass, you can cut it back to 6 to 9 inches to the ground. Late fall to early spring, you can divide it in the winter or the spring if you need to. You can see that they have two different things going from, because they are different species of grasses. Deadhead if desired. So the pretty pink flowers are eventually going to die, and they're going to, you know, start looking a little brown. If you desire to deadhead them, that's fine. I wouldn't necessarily feel like it's a necessity, because even the brown flowers are a feature, and then when the soft parts fall off, it's still, you know, it doesn't look terrible, so I would just leave it. But if you really need something to do for the day, that's something you can do. Then we have breeze grass, which is another one of the grasses that we have. You want to cut back these hard, so cut them to the ground, you know, 6 inches or so, probably even lower than that, to reinvigorate them. So you can do it every year. So in more, you know, high maintenance places, these grasses can be found in street medians and stuff like that. They're usually cut back to the ground maybe like twice a year or once a year. But in our ocean friendly gardens, we can do it every year or every 2 years, and you want to do this in the late spring to reinvigorate them. And so you get out all those brown leaves, and they, you know, get their perfect shape back. Okay, now we'll talk about annuals, even though there's only one annual that we'll ever talk about for these gardens. Our beautiful California poppy, that's our annual. The one thing about these plants is that they reseed so easily that they become weedy so fast. And you can see this is a picture of them at the Hermosa Beach Garden. So prolific seeders. It's crazy, because, you know, once that bloom comes, it's like a super bloom how many plants are going to show up. But you know that they're weedy, and it is a hazard to have them in a walkway, especially of a public space. So you have to go in there, and you can either deadhead them when they're after the flowers are spent, and you have to do it really quickly, because from flowers being spent to the seeds dropping seeds is like a very small window. So you can deadhead them, or you can simply just remove the plants after they have flowered, and so that kind of reduces the seeding. So next season it'll be a little bit lighter. But once again, these are very beautiful flowers, and they, you know, attract people. So you don't, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you end up with a lot of them. Just make sure they're not in the walkway of whatever garden that you're working in. And then the last topic we'll talk about is succulent care. Succulents are huge in the garden. So we have coral aloe, there's the deadlia, there's the blue chalk sticks, there's agave, there's many agaves in the gardens. And so agave pup, we talked about this last time. Even if the main plant doesn't live for a long time, it's going to produce a lot of baby plants. And yearly care is needed to address those pups. What you're gonna have to do is you're going to have to thin out the pups. So you're gonna have to remove a lot of the pups, and that's what's happening in this picture here. Had to remove a lot of pups because I'm telling you, if you leave these plants for 1 to 2 years, it's gonna be so many agave. So what you can do, you can just remove them and then you can plant them somewhere else, or send them to a green waste recycling facility. But they definitely need to be taken care of, or they just get too big mounds and aggressive, and it kind of looks a mess, and then it encroaches different plants and different features. So it's something that needs to be addressed. Trees, there's not a whole lot I'm gonna say about trees. I just threw this in at the end. Of course, we have the Western redbud and strawberry tree. What you want to do for those, you can head them back or thin them in the winter as needed. So there is a Western redbud tree at the Hermosa garden, and it is close to a window. So when the branches are getting a little bit too sprawling on that window, you can head back the branches a bit. You can thin it out if necessary, but these are trees, and most of them are pretty mature, so the structures are there from training, but that is something that you can do if necessary. And then we also, at the Hermosa Garden, there is also a Santa Cruz Island Ironwood. You can prune them in the summer after flowering, so you don't want to do it before then, because then you would cut the buds that had the flowers and then you wouldn't get as many flowers. And then also these plants produce a lot of suckers, so you want to remove the sprouts at the base, because they have, all the sprouts have the potential to grow into a fully grown tree, and so that's obviously not a good thing to have a tree close to another tree. So you want to remove those because they are taking from the mother tree. There's some coast live oaks. You want to prune in the summer. That's the only time you want to prune these trees, because they are susceptible to different insects, borers, and stuff like that. And so to avoid that, that's the only time when you want to prune them, when these insects are not active. But keep in mind, if there is a tree there, I know there's some Chinese elms at the Malibu garden. If the trees are there and if it's especially large, consult with the arborist. Don't just, start pruning it. Arborist will let you know what you should do structurally. So whatever city you're in, I'm sure there's a city arborist. Consult with them. Also, if the tree is really big, you cannot physically go out there and cut it. You would need an arborist with a crew of arboriculture necessary tools to prune a tree. So there's that. Okay, so that's all for today. I want to leave you with some points. So proper plant identification is the first crucial step in pruning. Knowing what type of plant it is and what this plant can take when it comes to pruning. When it comes to pruning in ocean-friendly gardens, do less. Once a season is something that we should be aiming for, maybe twice a year. Select the appropriate tools and the pruning methods for particular plants. Not every plant is susceptible to every method, so you want to make sure you're doing that to increase the longevity of the plants. And then you want to prune during their appropriate season for the best outcome. Remember, these plants do have to heal from these kites, and so you want to do it while they're on the up and up, and when they won't get sun damage, when they won't have heat damage, when they won't get frost damage. So that's something to consider. And that concludes our talk for the day. Next webinar, we'll be talking about irrigation system management, and that will be next Thursday at 10 a.m. See y'all then. Let me know if you have any questions. You can email me or Jennifer if there's any questions concerning these webinars. Thank you.